I'm not today. Anybody else want to lecture about short-run costs today? I'm ready for somebody to give a clear, good, funny lecture. No? No? All right. Okay. Shh. There we go. I like it. They're quiet. So where are we? I am, surprise, again, struggling with my technology here. I plugged it in and it didn't fully charge. So I brought a backup computer. We may end up at the end of lecture today actually using this thing behind me, Blackboard. It'll be terrifying. But we'll see how that goes. Okay, so where are we? We are still talking about costs quite a bit. We're going to continue that today, but today will be exciting. If things go as planned, which they never do, we're going to get to the short-run market equilibrium today, which you know as supply crosses demand, which is going to be pretty exciting. But where were we last time? We looked at expansion of production in the short versus in the long run. We drew something called an expansion path. In the short run, that expansion path is simply if you're going to try and get on a higher isoquant, the only way you can go is basically along the horizontal line that's at the level of capital you're stuck with, right? So it's always a nice horizontal line in the short run. In the long run, the expansion path looks, could be a straight line pointing up, or it could be a snake-like looking line pointing from San Diego towards Boston, where essentially you can adjust capital and labor in ways in order to minimize the cost of production. We then spent a tremendous amount of time talking about differences in short-run average cost versus long-run average cost, where we said in the short run, the best you can do is the same as in the long run, but on average, or usually short-run costs are higher than in the long run if you're using the wrong level of capital. We used that to draw the craziest picture ever, where we, for different levels of capital, drew a bunch of our U-shaped short-run average and marginal cost curves, remembering that in the short run, the U-shaped of average total cost comes from rapidly dropping average fixed costs at low levels of production and then diminishing marginal product of labor at higher levels of production. And then we, for each level of capital, drew the corresponding U-shaped cost curve, and then showed that the envelope of all of those cost curves, if I use the sort of the lowest level of these short-run cost curves, that's my long-run U-shaped cost curve. If the cost curve is U-shaped in the long run, that also means to me that at low levels of production, I have increasing returns to scale, versus at higher levels of production, I have decreasing returns to scale. So it was a lot, right? There was a lot of intuition crammed into last lecture. Today will be even more hardcore. All right, so what we finished up with last time is thinking about profit maximization, where I drew this profit curve, which I didn't tell you where it comes from at all, right? I just sort of drew it. It's an amazing movie with the fantastic English actor Hugh Grant, an Englishman that went up a mountain or a hill or something like that, so I just drew a hill. So that wasn't funny at all. I got a really horrible headache today, so we'll see how we do. I may take half a bottle of aspirin halfway through lecture. We'll see. So profit maximization, I drew a profit curve that I'll draw for you again in a second, and then it was pretty easy to spot that if that profit curve is actually true, you'd want to be right at the top of that profit curve, right? So if that profit curve looks something like this, hold on, this pen is way too thick. 2 works really well. Okay, so if we have dollars here and output here, I argued that the profit curve looks something like this. This is my profit curve, right, which tells me for each level of output the corresponding dollar amount of profit for that firm. It's pretty easy to see that this quantity right here is the optimal output quantity, right? This is the point where profits are maximized. I'm at the highest point of this profit curve right here. I can't get profits any higher, right? So what we then said is, well, what's true at that point right here, Q star, right? If I'm to the left of this point, somewhere here, let's say at point A, if I increase output, what happens to my profits? Do they go up or go down? They go up, right? So at A here, if I change my output, right, this is delta pi over delta Q, so the change in profits due to change in output is greater than 0. What about point B right here? If I increase output further from point B, what happens to my profits? They fall, right? So the change in profits due to a change in output is less than 0. So let's write that down. Delta pi over delta Q is less than 0. What's true at the top here? Right, what's true right here? The slope of the line is 0, right? So right at profit maximization, the change in profits due to a change in output, oops, something happened here with my writing. I'm writing too fast for Microsoft. The change in profit due to the change in output is exactly 0, right? The slope of the profit curve here is exactly 0. You can do this again with a shoelace, right? Again, let my shoelace be the marginal profit. Marginal profit is just change in profit due to a change in output, right? So the slope increases right here, positive slope, meaning you change output, your profit goes up until you get here. Here it's exactly level, so change in profit as you change in output is exactly 0. And if you go beyond the top, the slope changes to negative and your profits drop. So it should be quite clear that the point you want to be at on this curve is the highest point on the profit curve, which also happens to be the point where marginal profit, which is just the change in profit due to the change in output, is exactly 0. Now, that kind of makes sense, but we're going to get to a piece of language here that is going to be really, really useful, okay? And that piece of language that we're going to look at is one where I'm going to say, well, I want to use my optimal output quantity where profit is maximized, or the marginal profit is 0, or what I'm going to want to say is where the change in revenue is equal to the change in cost, okay? I want to show you that saying profit is maximized or marginal profit is equal to 0 is equivalent to saying marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Well, Max, that's really cute. I already see the works one tiny little proof on the slide here. I've never met a proof I liked, right? Actually, I've met many proofs I liked. I'm in the business of proving things. But the point here is, this seems odd. Well, let's think about this for a second, just intuitively, before I give you any math at all whatsoever, ever. What's marginal revenue? Okay? Marginal revenue is how much more money you take in from selling one more unit. Okay? So you sell one more unit, how does your overall amount of dollars taken in change? Marginal cost is, you already know this, how my total cost of production changes if I produce one more unit. Anybody want to volunteer for no money? Because I forgot cash today. I'm going to ask you a question. Anybody? Well, you don't know if that question's going to be hard. So let me volunteer. Max volunteers. All right. So Max, yeah. If you produce one more unit and your total revenues went up by $10, and the marginal cost of producing that additional unit is $5, would you produce that unit? Well, other Max, you're kind of an idiot. I can figure this out, right? If I take in $10 for producing that additional unit, but it only costs me $5 to produce it, what am I going to walk home with? $5. Am I going to produce this unit? Yeah, of course, right? So you're going to increase production. All right, Max, I got another question for you. Sure. How about if you increase output, you take in $5 more, but producing that additional unit of output costs you $10 more. Would you produce that unit? No, right? So if marginal revenue, the number of dollars that you take in from producing one more unit, is greater than the marginal cost of producing that one more unit, you're going to produce that additional unit. If marginal revenue, the number of dollars you take in from producing one more unit, is less than the marginal cost of producing that unit, you're not going to produce that unit. So if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, you're going to increase production. If marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, you're going to decrease production. So in both states of the world, you're going to do something about output, right? In the first one, you're going to increase output. In the second one, you're going to decrease output. What's the only state of the world where you're sort of indifferent and you're going to stay where you are? If they're the same, right? So Max, if the next unit, or if the current unit you're producing sold for, increased your revenue by $5, and the cost of that unit was exactly $5, are you going to produce more or less? I don't really care, right? If I produce more, if that profit function is true, then my marginal revenues are going to be less than my marginal cost, so that can't be optimal. If I produce less than that, then my marginal revenues are greater than my marginal cost, and I should produce more. So the only place where it's optimal for you to produce, given that profit curve I showed you, is the one where marginal revenue is exactly equal to marginal cost. All right? I have threatened to get many tattoos, but I'm going to threaten another one. The next one I'm going to get is one that says MR equals MC, right? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's how a profit-maximizing firm chooses its output level. It chooses its output level where the additional revenue it gets from selling one more unit is exactly equal to the additional revenue from selling... come on. Here we go. Is exactly equal to the additional cost of producing that last unit. All right. So that was a nice story, Max. But if you ask me to write that down, that seems complicated. And by the way, I'm kind of a numbers guy. Can you show me this using math? If you don't like math, close your eyes, visualize something really beautiful, like a blackcurrant scone or something like that, right? Carbs are always a nice thing to dream about. So let me show you the math. Give me a second to find my math. I'm sorry, I'm not as organized as I usually am. That's not saying much, Max. I'm drowning in paper. I'm teaching 2 classes and a second-year paper, so I have more paper in my office than I thought is actually legal, even for a tenured faculty member at UC Berkeley. Here we go. This is it. Okay. Is there really anything more beautiful than a blank sheet of paper? I don't think so. I love a blank sheet of paper. You could fill it with words, math. You could leave it empty and just stare at it. I'm going to fill this one with math, all right? So share my excitement for blank sheets of paper, and let's look at this for a second here. Okay, tiny little proof. So we argued that at profit maximization, marginal profit is 0, right? The change in profit due to a change in output is exactly 0. So in math terms, that means that this quantity here, change in profit due to a change in output, is exactly 0. Now, I'm going to do a little substitution here, okay? I'm going to write out profit. Okay, profit is simply revenue, total revenue, price times quantity, minus total costs, all right? Some of you may realize that the change operator is linear. What does that mean, Max? It means I can do this. Oops. Change in R minus the change in C over the change in Q. Right? So the change in profits, change in revenue minus cost, is exactly equal to the change in revenue minus the change in cost. That's just by properties of the delta operator right here. Now, what else can I do from that? Well, I've just got a subtraction in the numerator and something in the denominator, so I can write this as change in R over change in Q minus change in C over change in Q. Whoa. Whoa. And I know that this is 0 at profit max, right? So did we have a name for the change in C over the change in quantity? It ends in cost. Marginal cost, right? This here is just marginal cost. So if the change in C, the change in cost due to a change in output is called marginal cost, then the change in revenue due to a change in output is probably going to be called marginal revenue, right? So this is marginal revenue. So what I've derived here is that at the profit maximizing output level, can you tell I'm not on fire today? Here we go. Marginal revenue minus marginal cost is exactly equal to 0, or marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Wow, right? That's a really powerful result. It doesn't seem so exciting to you, but it is terribly exciting to me, right? I hate having to rely on others for information that I don't understand, right? So if my boss comes in and says it's optimal for us to produce 100 units, the first thing I do is I mimic my 5-year-old and I say, why, right? And unless the boss comes back to me and says, I figured out that at 100 units, our marginal revenue is exactly equal to our marginal cost, and that's the profit maximizing output quantity, I'm going to question my boss's sanity, right? So this little equation right here tells me at what output level am I maximizing profit. I simply look at what additional dollars do I take in from producing one more unit versus what the marginal cost of production is, and unless the two are the same, I am not profit maximizing, all right? This seems really, really trivial, but is a really important result that we're going to spend more time with than you wish, right? So this is the output decision. Choose the quantity at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, so that was the first rule, right? So we need to figure out what's the profit maximizing output quantity for a firm. We set marginal revenue to equal to marginal cost. Does that say anything about whether our profits are actually positive or negative or how big our profits are? Not really, right? We could have a profit curve like I drew for you, right, where the profit maximizing output level is actually positive, but I never said that that number is positive, right? If this here is 0 and this is your profit curve, marginal revenue equals marginal cost happens right here, but your optimal output level, Q star, right here is a level where your profits are negative, right? So the profit rule, all it tells you is where am I maximizing my profits, and those profits could actually be negative, right? The question is, should we as a firm actually produce Q star with negative profits, or are we better off shutting down? That seems like a really important question to me. So we will revisit our second question that the firm should ask when choosing to produce. A firm should stop producing if it can reduce its loss by doing so. So if you're making positive profits, should you produce? Positive economic profits. All resources are paid, full opportunity cost of your entrepreneurial talents, good looks, and whatever else you got going for you. It's all accounted for in my cost, and you're making money on top of that. Should you produce? The answer is yes, of course. What I'm going to argue now is, even if you're losing some money in the short run, right? Let's say the profits are negative, you may make a smaller loss by producing something and losing some money than by shutting down. So the question here is, if your profits are negative, right? You're losing money. Are you losing less money if you're going to produce Q star, or are you losing less money if you're going to produce 0 units, right? So we're going to come up with a rule that is initially not very intuitive, but quite smart to me. So a firm shuts down if its revenue is less than its avoidable variable cost. All right? What does that mean intuitively? So think about that for a second. You've got a bunch of capital, let's say $1,000 worth that you've got to pay for. Right? You have no choice whether you produce nothing or something. If you have to pay the $1,000, you've got to pay for it. Doesn't matter. Now, what you can choose to do is you can not produce at all, not hire any labor whatsoever, and just pay the expense of that piece of capital equipment. You're paying $1,000, you have 0 revenues. Right? That's the one choice. The other choice is you produce Q star, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Then you have labor costs, and you have some revenues. So the intuition here is pretty simple. If you produce output, and your revenues are bigger than the labor costs, right? That means when you're producing output, you're paying for all of your labor, and you have some money left over beyond what you have to pay for labor, so you can pay some of your capital expenditure from your revenues. Then your loss is smaller if you actually operate it, because you're taking in more money than the cost of the labor to produce that output, and you can pay off some of your capital. However, if you are producing, you're paying for labor to produce Q star, and at Q star, your total revenues of production are less than your labor bill, your wage bill. Then what you're doing is you have to pay for capital costs, and you can't even cover the full expense of labor, so you're better off just paying for your capital and not producing anything at all, right? So that's the intuition behind this thing. In fancy words, a firm shuts down if its revenue is less than its avoidable cost, and the only avoidable costs we have in these models are variable costs. So let's revisit this in a couple of different ways. Best way to revisit this is by doing an example. So let's look at a firm that is better off producing even though it's losing money. So if this firm operates, right? I'm not even giving you the output level here. R is total revenue if it operates, right? Variable costs are $100 if it operates, and fixed costs are $300. So its profits are total revenue if it operates is $200, minus its total costs of production are fixed costs, plus $100 of variable costs. So 200 minus 400 is minus 200. If the firm shuts down, meaning it doesn't produce any output, it of course has no revenues. It has still its fixed costs. Yeah, you can throw me curveballs, Microsoft. I can handle it. Does it have any variable costs? No, right? So its profits are minus 300. Now you were hired as a management consultant for several $1,000s a day. What would you tell this firm to do? Say it loud. Produce. Go forth and produce widgets, right? So you should operate. All right, that's clearly the right answer here, right? You're losing money in both scenarios, but you're better off by operating than by shutting down. Because what happens here is you're getting $200 worth of revenue, but you only have to spend $100 on labor, so you have $100 that you can use to pay off some of your capital expenditures. Versus here, if you don't produce, you have no revenue. You also have no variable costs, but you have to pay the full $300 of the capital expenditure. So the firm should operate. What would this look like for a firm that shouldn't operate? Well, this particular firm, if it produces at its Q star, this is a different firm, gets $50 of revenues. Its variable costs are $100. Its fixed costs are $300. So its profit, if it operates, it gets $50. That's total revenue. Its total cost of production are $300 plus $100. So $400 of costs, $50 of revenues. This firm loses $350. If the firm shuts down, it gets $0 in revenue. It pays $300 in fixed costs, has 0 variable costs, so it loses only $300. So this firm is clearly better off by shutting down. Now, do you have to do this calculation every single time? No, right? The rule is pretty simple. If your revenues are greater than your variable costs, you should produce, right? So you can just look at revenues, $50 versus variable costs, $100. Revenues here are smaller than variable costs. This firm shouldn't produce. If you use the same approach in the previous slide here revenues are $200, variable costs are $100. Revenues are greater than variable costs, so you should produce. As long as revenues are greater than variable costs in the short run, you should produce. If they're exactly the same, you're indifferent, right? Generally speaking, it's nice to give people a job, right? Because they go home and feed families and pay for health insurance and stuff like that. So if they're exactly equal, you can break either way, depending on whether you're a nice person or not such a nice person, all right? Everybody here is nice. So you love these slides, right? Why do you love these slides? Because Matt, you don't. I'm being sarcastic in case you can't pick it up. That was my biggest awakening coming to America, is that I'm a deeply sarcastic person and not everybody here gets it, right? It's so I turned into a nicer, less sarcastic person thanks to being in America. All right, shutdown rule. So when should the firm producing? If its revenues are less than its variable cost, right? That's the number 1 rule. You can say it in many, many different ways, but this bullet, and this bullet all say the same thing. But what this means is that in the short run, your profits can actually be negative and the firm should still